Hi everyone, thanks for coming and joining us on Monday the 9th of November. Thankfully, we have a very interesting person come to talk to us today. So Stephen, hi.
Hello, nice to see you again, Susie.
Yeah, thanks for coming by. Hey, we are going to talk about something that's, I think, quite heavy on a lot of people's minds at the moment.
Yes.
And
people are thinking about this right now.
Yeah. I tried to go on holiday last week. I went and stayed with my parents for a week, and it was probably one of the most stressful weeks to try and switch off because you just couldn't. So it's good to have some space. And so tonight, what we hope to offer in our conversation between Stephen and myself is a bit of space for processing some of the questions that have come up really from what's been going on in America for the last 4 years.
Yeah.
What I'd like to say to everyone is this is obviously going to be unashamedly political. So I'm just going to be myself, guys, and I'm just going to have my own opinions. You don't have to agree with me, and I'm not going to try and tell you what to think, but let's just be mindful that we might have differing opinions, and that's fine. That's all part of the body of Christ. But yeah, I'm not gonna. I'm just gonna be me, because I think it takes too much energy to try and mediate for different opinions when things are actually quite deeply resonant, if that makes sense. So I hope that's okay with everyone. If it's not, oh well. So Stephen, would you like to share a little bit about your story, where you've come from and what you've done in your life? Because I think it's really quite interesting, and it's really pertinent to what we're talking about, and why you particularly have got some insight to offer into this question.
So first of all, my accent is Canadian. I'm not American. So that I probably say
Get that clear.
But so I grew up in a part of Canada that was the Bible Belt of Canada. So it was my father taught in a Bible college. They were my town. The Bible college was self-described as fundamentalist. So this wasn't an insult. They proudly called themselves this. And I grew up in a very conservative environment. It was politically as well as theologically, where people really strongly identified their Christianity with patriotism, guns, didn't like gay people, didn't like liberals, didn't believe that climate change was real. So you get the picture, right? We and all of our like I was taught in a Christian school, and I was taught by Americans who believed this. So Americans would come up to our little town. I grew up with James Dobson, Focus on the Family. Liberty University would print textbooks that we read in school. So I grew up an American evangelical. I think technically I had a Canadian passport, but basically I grew up in this exact same culture that we see now in America, dominating the political landscape with the conservatives. And when I was 19, my dad is English, and I'd always had an English connection, and I wanted to see what England was like. So I just moved. When I was 19, I left small town, conservative, redneck, Western Canada, and I just moved. And I lived in Dorset. I lived in Bournemouth for a year.
Oh, nice.
And after that, I lived in Guildford because I met some friends, and I moved to Guildford. And I was 19, 20. I was working in Waterstone's bookshop in Guildford. And I basically was experiencing this idea that I'd grown up thinking that Christianity was very much associated with there's a whole lot of boxes you need to check. You have to believe in 6-day creation. You have to believe you're going to be raptured. You have to not like gay people very much. You have to like guns. You have to be patriotic. Abortion was you couldn't think seriously about abortion at all. There was only one thing to think about abortion. All of that stuff. And I moved to England, where I was in churches where not everybody checked all the same boxes all the time. And yet they all still were in one church together. And I had experiences where I moved to England just at the rise of Cool Britannia and the Tony Blair era. Okay. In fact, that was the first election I ever voted in.
Wow.
Yeah. So my political life started here in England. But the point was that I was in these churches where for the first time in my life, I couldn't tell who everyone was going to vote for. Okay. That does not happen when you grow up in conservative, redneck, fundamentalist North American Christianity. It is not an open question. Right? Whereas this was genuinely an open question, and people genuinely weren't all in agreement about lots of issues, really important issues, and they didn't agree with each other, and yet they're all in one church together. And this unsettled me. I had this, it wasn't a crisis of Christian faith, but I actually took a break from church for a while. Not because I was mad, it was just, where do I sit with this? I don't really understand. They're not acting the way I thought Christians were supposed to act. I wasn't angry. I was personally I did physically and voluntarily chose to leave that culture I was born into, right? So it wasn't like I was trying to convert everybody to my conservative ways. But I didn't really know what the options were. I was like, I need to step back a bit and take a look. And that's when I was working in this bookshop in Waterstones, and I was using my employee discount to read through the world's classics. I was 20 years old and I was teaching myself the world's classics. And I discovered Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Kafka and all these strange Russian Germanic names. And one of those names was Kierkegaard, who I'd heard of. In fact, I'd only ever heard of Kierkegaard. In my evangelical school, I was warned against him. So, somebody wrote a book that his ideas were ruling the world from his grave, and he was all about individualism or something. So anyway, I picked up Kierkegaard and I started to read this book called Fear and Trembling. And I've described this before, and if people have heard me on a podcast or my radio show or whatever, don't forgive me for repeating the anecdote, but I actually felt vertigo. I felt dizzy. It felt like the only other time I've ever felt vertigo reading something was when I read a Batman comic. You can see my comics behind me. I actually felt like the world had kind of dropped out underneath the book, and I was on this a bit dizzy height. It's an odd experience. And Kierkegaard was describing basically my situation. He died in 1855. He never left Denmark. And yet he was describing American evangelical culture. And he called it Christendom. Mm-hmm. And he was saying there is a huge difference between Christendom and authentic Christianity. And by Christendom, he didn't mean an official church and state relationship. He didn't just mean like the Church of England, because the Church of England is also a form of Christendom. But what he meant was where Christianity is the cultural, it sets the stage, where it's the backdrop to everything else going on, where streets are named after saints or where churches are landmarks. That's Christendom. Where you ask somebody, are they a Christian? And they go, well, I'm white and I speak Danish or I speak English, so I guess I'm a Christian. Where they confuse their membership being born into a civilization with being a follower of Jesus, right? Mm-hmm. And this book, Fear and Trembling, just really hammers away at this idea that actually being a follower of Jesus will put you, originally in the New Testament, it put you at odds with your common culture. Mm-hmm. The culture you were born into, being a follower of Jesus didn't make it easier to be a good patriot. Mm-hmm. It meant you were a bad patriot. It meant that you were brought out of your common culture and that they saw you as an enemy. And he said, now what do we get? Christendom, and this is the charge that he made. He said, Christendom has done away with Christianity. It no longer exists. People who think they're Christian just because they're a member of a certain culture, or they're patriotic, or they're good citizens, they have never met the actual Jesus. They've never been confronted with the offense that Jesus might pose. And until somebody's confronted with that, they can never have said to have met Jesus or have faith in Jesus, right? So, and it kind of come down to people who confuse their nationality with their religion. That's basically what it comes down to. And so then I decided I wanted to study. I come to England to study university, and I was going to study English literature the whole time. And I was 21 by this stage, and I was going to be coming to university later on, I guess, in life. 21, very old, very mature.
Ancient.
Ancient. I was going to study English literature, and I actually had in the old days with the UCAS form, where you had a paper form and a pencil, and I was going to check the English literature box. That was all I was ever here for. And I let my eyes wander down the list, and there was one that said, you could also study philosophy and theology. And I thought, oh, if I don't, I'm always going to like English literature. But theology and philosophy is not something I would read for fun, but I think it's important. And I might get to study more Kierkegaard that way. Somebody might teach me some Kierkegaard. So I checked the box very spontaneously. Changed my life. That's what I've done now. So I went to did my undergraduate in philosophy and theology. I chose Kierkegaard whenever I had options. I did my master's. I actually, and sort of ridiculously, I have three master's degrees in Kierkegaard.
Wow.
And then I did my doctorate on Kierkegaard's critique of Christian nationalism. And I published that in 2011. I think it was 2011. And people said, oh, that's a dead subject. That's irrelevant. Christian nationalism isn't relevant today. We're over that now.
Oh, boy.
Christian nationalists are in charge or in the ascendancy in pretty much any Christianized country you care to name. Christian nationalists are either in charge or a very significant power block. Yeah. This has not gone away. In fact, my argument is nationalism is the most powerful religion. It is more powerful than Christianity. It's not good, it's not better, but it's way more powerful and it's way more popular. And that the religion of Christian nationalism, at every point, it does the opposite of what Jesus would say or do. And so I feel like this is not just it's not just the Nazis putting people into Holocaust ovens, right? Christian nationalism is the mainstream now. And we need to start noticing that it's forming people who think they are Christian in this Kierkegaardian sense. They think they are Christian because they are American or they're British or they go through the motions of Remembrance Sunday or Christmas or whatever, and they're just members of their culture. They're not Christian.
Yeah.
There you are. That's so all of a sudden my life is now relevant again, and this is why I get texts and emails constantly.
Yeah.
And a lot of Americans are distressed, and how did we get to this and all that kind of thing, and I'm sure we talk about it. And I even started a whole podcast just about this.
Yeah, so I found that really helpful over the summer, actually, because you started it around the time where we had the Black Lives Matter with George Floyd and Trump holding the Bible, didn't you?
The Bible one was so when Trump used the violence of the state to clear out peaceful protesters in order to hold up a book he doesn't read in front of a building he doesn't go to, as a message to his Christian base.
Yeah.
And it worked. Of course it worked. It worked amazingly well. And I had that, for some reason, out of all the things Trump said and did in the last 4 years, for some reason that was one that really set people off. And I got lots of emails. And I thought, and rather than write responses to every single person. I just hopped on a mic because I was stuck in lockdown, same as everybody else. And I just recorded it. And I started to just go through how this happened, what it means, what the alternatives could be. And we are 21 episodes in.
Yeah.
And now we're interviewing people, and we interview various people from different walks of life. And we also continue to do Bible studies and theology discussions. And it's just all about the alternative to nationalism. What could it look like? Yeah.
So, folks, there's a bigger conversation than we could possibly get through tonight, but we'll share the links to all of that stuff that Stephen's doing at the moment if you want to get involved later. But I think really, so one of the things that I personally, and I hear a lot from a lot of sort of my colleagues and my friends, is just this, like, what is going on there? What is that all about? How in the world could someone like Trump have any support from a Christian base, let alone the level of support that he's getting, and in the wake of the election, still getting in ever increasing numbers? And obviously, like, we are in a different culture and a different sort of political relationship with religion. And we in the UK have our divisions. And you know, I'm not saying that our politicians are any great shakes really either, but it does seem to be like another level over there. And I think can you shed any light on that? Like, what is going on there? Why is he able to say things, do things like holding up this Bible, and it has that response? And what's the background?
So I think it's something to do with the fact that, look, Americans didn't invent Christian nationalism, but they sure are perfecting it. Okay, so you can find Christian nationalism. Basically, you can find it from basically the Constantinian era onwards, when Christians started finding that they were in charge of nations and empires and city-states. That's when you start to get this idea that it's a Christian's job to rule the world. And for the first 300 years or so of Christianity, they didn't think that. And it was only when they started to have responsibility and power that they started to think this is part of our mandate. What you get with America, so they didn't invent this by any means, but what you get with America is a country that was founded on that principle. So all the other countries have had Christianity kind of bolted in or bolted on. And it comes in after the place is already in operation. There's already a people group. And with the American experiment, what you had was there has never been a time when America has not been a Christian nationalist country. It was founded on it. It began with the genocide of the natives who were there in order to expand. American exceptionalism and expansion is baked into American history. They expanded Manifest Destiny, where they expanded out into the New World and displaced and killed the people who were already there and replaced it with their culture. Christianity wasn't bolted on to Native American culture. Native Americans were eradicated, basically. And what was left was Christian nationalists who said, this land is our land. This has been given to us by God. We are going to stamp our rule on this land. And they saw it like a blank slate that had been given to them. Finally, at last, all Christian history has been leading to us. Okay. It's always been part of the Christian mandate to rule empires. And now finally, we get to start fresh. Because all the other empires had to be Christianized. America got to start with it being Christian. And it's basically, that's what's happened. So when you look at like a Trumpy type thing, and I always get these, especially evangelicals, they go, how did this happen? How did we fall so far? How did we get to this place? And I'm like, what are you talking about? You have never not been like this. It's just that Trump has been able to, lots of things have boiled together at once, but the grievance culture of American Christians who think they've lost the narrative of their nation. They've had generations of feeling paranoid, of feeling that their nation's been taken away from them. All the narratives boil down to a kind of a patriotic idea that it's their right to rule their nation. Even the abortion thing is actually connected to patriotism, because the way they want, everybody thinks, oh, it's just because he gave them what they want on abortion. Well, there are actually lots of ways to think about abortion, even including if you don't like abortion. But the way the Americans evangelicals did it was, the language they use is all about taking back the power, taking back the narrative, controlling the laws. They didn't put any effort into changing this, changing the options, or making it less likely that a poor woman would need to have an abortion or would want to have one, right? They don't care about that stuff. They only care about controlling the narrative and dominating the laws, because it's back to the patriotic idea that it's our job to run our country. That's what we're supposed to do.
So this is where this sort of persecution complex comes from.
Yeah, it's deep. It's deep, deep, deep.
Because that just feels like completely like, poor little rich boys in a way. Do you know what I mean? Like,
well, it's bizarre because
things that come through.
I'm also a historian. I've written a couple of church history books.
Okay.
I can say this. I'm not even it sounds like an exaggeration. There has never been a group of Christians in all of history who have had more concentrated wealth and power than American evangelicals. They are the most powerful group, hands down, that has ever existed in the name of Christendom. They have more resources, more guns, and more babies than the Victorian Empire had. They've got faster access to information than the Romans ever had. Like, the American evangelical domination of our cultural imagination is much deeper and more widespread than any other Christianized empire. They are not the underdogs.
Yeah.
They really are, but they absolutely thrive on that, because well, think about it. It comes from the Puritans, the idea right from the start. The aggrieved minority, fleeing persecution, wanting to start again with a clear patch of land that they now get to control. That has never not been the case. And once Trump comes along, he's able to, or him and his people, he's not clever enough to manipulate this. He's just the guy who was there at the right time. But it boiled over and it was ready to go when he showed up. Yeah.
And so is there like, there must be a very particular way of reading scripture and a very particular kind of take on, a lot of the stuff that when I read my Bible, I do not recognize, these actions. I don't recognize this God. And yet, it's more or less the same text. So like, do you think they realize that there's these different, or do they not care that it's, this is what works for us? What's going on there?
Do you know who Paula White is?
Yeah.
Do you know who she is?
The advisor.
So she's Donald Trump's official spiritual advisor.
Yeah.
She's a charismatic mega church preacher, TV evangelist type, writes loads of books. Very prominent Christian leader in America.
Okay.
She was invited by Christianity Today magazine, which is the largest evangelical magazine in the world, but in America, but in the world. And she was given as much space as she wanted to make the case for what's the Christian case for Donald Trump? That was the brief she was given. Okay? How many times do you think she mentioned the name Jesus Christ?
Once?
0.
No, not at all. Never.
She didn't mention. You can find it online. I did a word search.
Wow.
Yeah, I read the whole thing and I was like, that can't be true. And I did a word search. She did not mention the name or the life or the example of Jesus Christ a single time.
Wow.
And guess what? This happens all the time.
Okay.
The Christian right doesn't like Jesus very much. They do not talk about him. And again, this isn't like liberal bias. I'm not trying to twist Paula White's words.
Mm-hmm.
He was given as much space as she wanted.
Yeah.
This is what she wrote. She didn't even notice. And she obviously she can't actually recruit Jesus Christ into her narrative because he stands against everything that she's standing for. What you can do, so you can't run a country on the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah.
You can damn well try running a country on the Ten Commandments. And what we find, and we've actually found this quite a lot, it's not just Americans, that wherever Christianity starts to become powerful in a nation or an empire, Jesus really goes by the wayside.
Mm-hmm.
But Old Testament figures in the Old Testament really starts to get ramped up.
Mm-hmm.
So you get King David, King Cyrus, Moses, Joshua. Those are the big kind of heroic autocratic dictator hierarchy types. They get mentioned all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus never gets mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And so you say, oh, they're reading the same Bible. They're not really.
Okay.
They actually don't encounter. I spent a year in Bethel Church in Redding, California, and my wife was studying there. And it was during the run up to the Trumpageddon, actually. And Bethel Church leadership is all very pro-Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, I was there, and I think I heard the Sermon on the Mount preached about once the whole time I was there in a whole year, and that was from a guy. He wasn't even American. He was a visiting preacher, and you just think it's not like they're standing up being against the Sermon on the Mount. It just doesn't enter onto their radars because you can't run a country that way. But the whole point of being a Christian for these people is to run the country.
Okay.
And so their Bibles are very, if you could do a graphic of like, how much do you actually, what parts of the Bible do they actually read as opposed to what's actually in the Bible? You get a lot of Revelation and you get a lot of Old Testament kings and you get a lot of priests laying down the purity laws.
Mm. It's about
You don't get mutual submission, everyone submit one to another. You don't get turn the other cheek. You don't get lay down your life for your friends and go to the cross. Mm-hmm. Oh, the only time you do get greater love is this, that you lay down your life for your friends, is when they're memorializing their wars. Mm. And they twist now laying down your life for your friends is very different from killing your enemies. The only time these people mention these verses is when they're talking about killing in the name of patriotism. So the religion is patriotism using biblical passages and figures in order to serve the patriotism. They are not reading the Bible through the lens of Jesus, and they are not putting Jesus as their lens that they're reading their nationalism through. That, not at all. Anything that hits nationalism, like Jesus gets bounced back at the first hurdle. If it affects patriotism, they don't pay attention to it.
And is there any level of self-awareness of that?
No. No. I've had like sit down one-to-one conversations with these people, and because it comes from a view of what the Bible is. It's a very flat view of the Bible, which is, well, it's all the Bible, so it's all valid. Okay. I know Jesus said turn the other cheek, but Joshua has dash your babies' heads against the rocks when you invade a foreign land, so I guess that's valid. And that's because it's his view of the Bible, which is actually un-Christ-like as well. Yeah. Right? Jesus doesn't figure in, he doesn't help them read the Bible either. Yeah. So, and again, that comes from the biblical literalist stream in American Christianity, but which itself, by the way, had patriotic roots. So it was founded on desire to create good citizens. Okay. So even the fundamentalism actually comes out of patriotism. Yeah, it's not the other way around. They're not reading the Bible and finding patriotism in it. They are patriots who then have this book,
bringing their own lens and their own baggage to it. Yeah. And
that happens just all the time. I've kind of lost track. You can do it yourself. Like, just go and find some. I always have a couple of tests. I say this to my students as well. It's like, read this essay by this Trump supporter or whatever. Just imagine you're a Martian and you don't know anything about Jesus, what would you learn about Jesus from reading this Christian defense of whatever, right? And just try and see. And it's all about guns and self-defense and military and Israel and industrial military complex supporting of a state, nation state. Nothing about Jesus.
Yeah. So the
These
Israel thing,
themselves, about themselves.
right? Yeah, yeah. The Israel thing is something that feels to me very American,
Yes,
even though obviously the British, you know, had quite a lot to do with
did.
the
Yeah,
politics of it.
yeah.
But this kind of Zionism, kind of, I don't know what it is.
But it's the nationalism again, right? It's the nation. It's the so Americans see in a certain narrow form of Zionism or a nation state, they see Zionism as a support of the ethno nation state, right? And they see themselves in that story, very similar to the way the Brits did as well. So a lot of the rhetoric that the Americans now use about themselves, Christian Americans use about themselves, is what the British were using about themselves when they had their empire.
Mm-hmm.
If you do a study, I've done some studies of the rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
So it might change. Let's give them 100 years when America's lost their control and see what happens. Right now, they're at the height of their empire.
Yeah.
And they're seeing Israel as like their co-national. It's like a mirror image to them, really.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, we're the new chosen people, but here's the old chosen people. Let's both.
Okay.
And of course, they also find that in their scriptures because all they find is the stuff about setting up nations, because that's what they're interested in finding. And so they love all the parts about Israel coming to its nationhood in the Old Testament. They don't even notice the parts that Jesus says where he directly dismantles nationalism in Israel.
Yeah.
He doesn't give them what they want. And he doesn't do the ethnic freedom fighter thing. And he doesn't kick the Romans out of the occupied territories or any of that stuff. And that's where that all comes from, really. It's they see in Israel like a mirror image of what they themselves think. They think they're that as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So this thing about influence I find quite interesting, and because I hear echoes of it from my evangelical charismatic days, and this kind of idea that we kind of have to try and be Christians in influential places.
Yeah, did you ever have 7 mountains or 7 spheres?
No, but I remember listening to you talk about that, and it kind of was like, oh wow, yeah, like kind of things that had been like laid down, you know, when I was at uni or whatever, just the circles that I was in at that point. I was like, oh. So could you share a bit about that?
Well, it's quite prevalent. So I would say like a lot of the people that, if you're in some British youth group and somebody says, hey, well, there's 7 spheres of influence, it'd be good if we were in all of them. I'm not thinking that those people are hardcore nationalists, right?
Yeah.
I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that came from hardcore nationalism.
Yeah, okay.
What it came from, it's called the 7 Mountains theology or whatever. And the idea is that they're American nationalists, identified 7 spheres: business, school, entertainment, politics, church, whatever. And they've identified these different spheres of influence, and they're saying it's our job to get Christians in places of positions of power in each of those spheres. And so this gets taught a lot. I was taught this in school. I found like you, I found British people who've also encountered it, and it seems relatively benign. But actually its roots are very much in Christian American nationalism, this idea that they got to take back control. If you want to be interested, like have a look at this guy named Rick Joyner, Morning Star Ministries. He's a charismatic, very influential American preacher. He's a real 7 Mountains guy, and just go have a look at his stuff. You'll see what I mean. It's violent takeover, actually. Like he's promoting violent takeover of the country, and that's where it all came from. And so we get a watered down version of it.
Yeah. But in some ways that's more insidious, isn't it? Because actually, you're right, it doesn't kind of raise any flags
No.
necessarily. Without knowing where these things have come from, you can kind of adopt them in a milder form, but they do end up being formational.
Well, they do, because what they're forming is your idea that, oh, Susie, it's your job as a Christian to be influential.
Mm.
That's your job. Like, that's part of your toolkit, is you got to have a position. You got to get your fingers on the buttons of power. And that is not the imagination of the earliest Christians in the New Testament. That was not what they were trying to do. And so, but we have this, people have this they're just locked on to the idea that well, then how can you live in this world? How can you, if you see some evil, then surely you must change the laws and change it all. You have to do what it takes to win, or the ends justify the means, or you must get into power no matter what, even if it means compromising. We have all these justifications we give ourselves in order to have our fingers on the buttons of power.
Yeah.
And we justify it to ourselves because we think having your fingers on the buttons of power is what Christians are supposed to do. And Jesus said, do not lord your power over others like the Gentiles.
Yeah. Right, it's like completely opposite of what Jesus modeled anyway. And
Kenosis in Philippians 2, the famous hymn where Jesus didn't consider equality with God a thing to be grasped. Instead, and then in English, sometimes we say he made himself nothing, which isn't a good translation. Better one is he emptied himself, or he put a limit on his own will. So when you empty yourself, your ego isn't flowing to fill the room. You're not filling the room with yourself. You're self-emptying. You're practicing self-control. And in Philippians, the earliest hymn there of Jesus, written within living memory of him, by the way, they say Jesus was a powerful figure. He was equal to God, like a Caesar, but he didn't consider being equal to God like an emperor a matter for grasping power and dominating others, which is the word arpagmon, exploited to his own advantage. Instead, they said, he put a limit on his will to make space for other wills. That was the earliest image of Jesus of what power is supposed to look like. And I don't see any American nationalist ever doing that. Putting a limit on their will to make space for other wills.
Yeah, no, it's not a natural position for
No.
many of us probably, but yeah.
You can see why they like Trump.
Yeah, right.
Fully. Now there's a Christian Dumais. Have you heard of Professor Christian Dumais?
No.
He wrote a book called Jesus and John Wayne, which I really highly recommend.
Okay.
Looking at toxic masculinity in evangelical American culture, and how the worship of the bully and the alpha male has just made Trump. That's why they like him. I mean, if you asked that, you earlier on said, how can they look at Trump and then go support him? It's like, and this is what Professor Dumais says as well. She's like, this isn't an aberration. This is the fruit of what has long been going. They want this guy. They want the bully. They think the biggest, loudest, swinging dick in the room is the right thing to be. Right?
Yeah.
They want it. And they cheer loudest when he is most insulting to his enemies in the room.
Yeah.
They are not horrified by this. They think it's God's gift to them. So, and it's just the exact opposite of the image of Jesus. It's hard to come up with something more opposite. Why I have no hesitation in saying they might be using Christian language, but they are not following the way of Jesus at all. There's nothing there. There's nothing Christ-like there. No, it's not a Christian nation. Well, it's Christian in name. It's I'm white and I speak English kind of Christian, but it's not. There's no truth or goodness or life there.
Yeah. And what I guess what concerns me a little bit, maybe I don't know if I've got a right to be concerned, but is just seeing how influential some of these big churches, like you mentioned Bethel earlier, and how influential they actually are globally, but particularly here, and in the evangelical circles in the UK. We look to the American mega churches a lot, the celebrity pastors, all of that kind of stuff, everyone that writes books, and
celebrity pastors, there you go, biggest alpha male in the room. That's that again. Anyway.
But like, kind of, that I don't know, I've been really wrestling with what to do with that. And when we were talking earlier, I mentioned that, you know, I can't worship to those songs at the moment, and I've struggled with that.
What do you do, like when somebody starts singing a Bethel song or a Sean Foyt song or something? Do you sit silently, or do you protest? What do you do?
Well, if I'm in my church, then yeah, go to my happy place.
Yeah,
I, I, it makes me feel a bit ill,
yeah,
actually, you
yeah,
know, and I just grieve it. I grieve it a lot because it used to be a place of great blessing for me, that style of worship, and I've moved away from that for lots of reasons. But um, I, you know, we were always taught at Soul Survivor and such, you know, that worship is the overflow of your heart.
right.
And then I look at the kind of commodification of that,
Yeah,
which is another thing, isn't it? Capitalism and all of this stuff. But the kind of, you know, the way that actually, okay, well, we might be singing a fairly innocuous song, but if it was written by someone that supports this, that is idolizing and supporting Trump,
yeah,
then actually, what is that heart?
yeah, exactly.
And I just personally have really struggled with, you know, it's kind of colored that whole dynamic of spirituality for me, that I just can't. I'm like, oh, it makes me shudder.
Yeah, yeah. I was saying earlier today to my friend, he was kind of asking in one of these texts, asking advice, and it's like, in all honesty, I'm not trying to be like some throw your toys out of the pram thing, but like, we just need to stop consuming anything produced by a nationalist.
Mm,
Like, if they don't recognize and repent of nationalism, I don't want their words in my life,
mhm.
because it's you wouldn't you wouldn't listen to worship songs written by a, I mean, I don't even want to name different religion, but like, you know what I mean? Like, it's a different religion.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just a different religion, and it's a different God. It has a different set of values. Not only is it a different set of values, it's Jesus is often openly mocked, or his values are openly mocked from the stage.
Mm,
Like at Bethel, I was talking to the guy Chris Valentin, and he says, yeah, because he gave a sermon about Romans 13 and talked about dropping bombs on American bombs on Middle Eastern villages, and everybody was cheering in the Bethel church. And he asked me for feedback because I'm a political theologian. So I didn't go up to him complaining. He asked me for feedback, and I said, there's people cheering for the killing of their enemies and their neighbors
yeah,
in your church, and he didn't care. And
mm.
he went, yeah, I do that. So I was like, whenever I say anything like that, people always say, oh, you should turn the other cheek. And he waved his hand like that.
Wow.
So he just instinctively just went, yeah, turn the other cheek. Like, you just have said that Jesus is your king.
Yeah.
You're singing about it. There's tears glistening on your cheeks. And when somebody just repeats Jesus's words to you when it comes to what to do with your enemies, you go, yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
Right? This is not, I'm not saying he's a bad man. I'm not saying he's Hitler. Just saying he's not a follower of the way of Jesus.
Yeah. There's a disconnect there, isn't there?
So why are you consuming their stuff?
Mm, mm,
And anything good you can get from them, you could probably get from other people who aren't also worshiping their nation.
mm, mm. Yeah. Yeah, right. And don't have the mega bucks to.
Unwean ourselves from America for a while.
Yeah. 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 Interesting. Well, Stephen, I think we'll draw our conversation to a pause, and let's put everyone into breakout groups. And guys, if you have about 10 minutes in smaller groups to reflect on what you've heard and what we've been talking about, it'd be great to generate some questions for Stephen. And a useful structure that I find when doing this, when there's a lot of stuff that could be, is to try and identify something that's really helped you, something that's brought you life or has been really helpful, something that has challenged you or you feel a bit unsettled about, and then one question that you want to sort of take forward or something that you want to find out more from. So it's a little bit of an examine sort of flavor, reflection, find some life, find some tension, and and what do you want to take next? And we'll have 10 minutes in breakout groups, and then we'll come back and Stephen will field your questions.
Yeah, great.
Cool.
See you in 10 minutes.
Yeah. Thank you. Great. I hope everyone had good chat. If you can you just mute yourselves?
Yeah.
That would be really helpful. So we did have some questions in the chat before before we left. Did you get a chance to look at them, Stephen?
Yeah, good one here about works righteousness. Just a second.
Okay.
So, somebody wrote, it seems to me that many of the evangelical churches in America are afraid that they'll be teaching works righteousness if they talk about the Sermon on the Mount. Yeah, this is a very good point. Or if they teach the way of Jesus, it seems like they are reacting to what they see as works-based righteousness teaching of non-evangelical churches, right? Hence, the emphasis has been on justification by faith, salvation by grace through faith. Yeah. So, I mean, yes, no argument there. Yeah, really good observation. And I guess my point is that these things are, it's more like, why do they put so much effort? What is the, how do I put this? What is the attraction? Like, why do they work so hard to remove Jesus from their Christianity? Like, why are they clutching at any straw they can? And that, because there are a lot of ways to see Jesus without going straight into works righteousness. You don't, the Sermon on the Mount isn't the thing you do so that you get to heaven when you die. Mm-hmm. It's a description of what, it's very clearly a description of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Now that I've saved you, here's how you should act, basically. It doesn't require a theology degree to see things that way. But what nationalists do is they overcomplicate the thing by creating conflict where there really isn't one. Mm-hmm. And they pit parts of scripture against other parts of scripture, or they very clearly just choose to favor one. So they very clearly favor Paul over Jesus and Moses over Jesus. And it's just bizarre. And in fact, it's it doesn't take that much effort to find a way to read Jesus as fulfilling the law and the prophets, or as Paul as being a good follower of Jesus. Or it doesn't take much effort at all. What it does take is the will to admit that the way of Jesus might put your nation in some sort of jeopardy, or your patriotism will be affected. Mm-hmm. And that it is interesting how often that becomes the stumbling block. Mm-hmm. Because I believe in non-violence resistance to evil, and often will talk about this. And easily the most common reaction is, yeah, but that's all very well, but you can't run a country that way. Mm-hmm. And they privatize Jesus's ethics as if it wasn't. And they've invented a difference between public and private. And they say, well, Jesus is just for private morality, and there's other things for public responsibility. And they've invented that distinction, for example. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of similar to what they've done with the Sermon on the Mount when it comes to works, righteousness, and that kind of thing. It's like it's a fiction, a legal fiction or a theological fiction, mm-hmm. which in fact just preserves us from having to take Jesus seriously at his own word.
Yeah, because that's what's costly, right?
Right. And it's very unhistorical as well, because the early Christians were living this way. Like, it's really telling. So the New Testament, all the epistles, Paul's letters and Peter's letters, and all these letters from the early church, they are the documents of the earliest group of Christians that we have. Historically, they are the earliest documents we have. Mm. And they are essentially written, you can watch the Christians trying to organize themselves. Like, so much of the letters are actually just about how to organize ourselves well, mm-hmm. how to resolve conflict, what a good leader looks like, what it looks like to be a good follower. Like, they care about that. That's what most of the letters are about. At no time does anybody in the early church go, you should act like King David, or you should be like Moses, or you should be like Joshua. Like, they don't appeal to any of those people. Mm. They say you should be like Jesus. Mm. And then they offer an image of Jesus who is not violent, not power hungry, not laying down laws. It's just, the contrast is so stark. This is part of what I'm saying, is that all these justifications, which even you're on the chat so rightly pointed out, basically come down to, well, we couldn't run a country that way, so we're going to find a different way to read it.
More convenient.
Yeah.
So Henry, you've put your hand up. Would you like to unmute yourself?
You read the questions, or if that's all right, Susie, rather than me.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Cool.
There's a chap called Henry who had his hand up.
Hello, good evening. Stephen, thank you very much indeed. Really interesting. And I just wonder to what extent it's the way this is framed for this evening, I guess, but to what extent it's helpful to see this as about America and about America being radically different. And you've already alluded to the fact that it's not necessarily that at all. There's plenty of similar thinking in plenty of other places closer to home. It's a little bit less comfortable to think about it, and it's been evident a bit already this evening that that's so. But I'm really interested in your nationalist, your take on this being nationalism, essentially core nationalism. But also, isn't there something a bit more pervasive and underlying and rooted in interpretations of Christianity that are about salvation? Salvation in the sense of, I have been saved. Sorry about that, and now I can do pretty much what I like because I've been saved, and I'm going to heaven in the next life. I've stood up. Billy Graham came to the meeting. I gave my testimony. I had all this at university, as I'm sure lots of other people have. Yeah. All of that very insidious, very odd theology, but very pervasive in this country and very widely understood among Christians as being acceptable. So once you've accepted those things, a lot of what happens in America, as we see most extremely, follows, and you don't question, and you just go with the flow, because you don't really follow Jesus, as you're saying. You actually follow something about yourself and your own justification.
So I'm holding up, as you're talking, I'm holding up this book. This is a guy named William Cavanaugh, who is a Roman Catholic social political theologian. And he wrote a book called Migrations of the Holy. He's an American guy. He is absolutely brilliant. And he absolutely gets it. And I've been talking a lot about America because I just say Americans perfected nationalism, but they did not invent it. And in fact, in this book, Migrations of the Holy, he's talking about the language of captured imagination. He says, he basically holds out a view of the formation of the nation state, because nations and nation states didn't always exist in the current form they are now. And in fact, their history is relatively recent. It coincides roughly with the Protestant Reformation.
Absolutely.
Which is no coincidence that evangelicalism and nation states go hand in hand. Correct. But anyway, and one of the things he's saying is, like, you've got to chart the rise of this, is that as the nation state essentially looms larger in the cultural imagination, and people start to identify themselves with their nation state more than with anything else, any other group they might have been a part of. Yeah. What you see is the colonization of the imagination. And he calls it a migration of the holy, and where people would normally look to the church to decide who decides who's valid to live and die, who justifies when it's okay to use violence, and who and how. Now it's the state that tells you. So now we live in a world in which nobody, I've done this, I go to American colleges and I ask the whole room, the Christian colleges, who here thinks that it's legitimate to kill another person in the name of your church? Nobody raises their hand. Who here thinks we should support the troops? Everybody raises their hand. Like, all right, so you think killing a human being in the name of a church is irrational and immoral, but killing a human being in the name of your nation is reasonable and right. And this is what Kavanaugh says, it's the migration of the holy. What is considered holy and true hasn't been done away with, it's just been migrated to another group. And so when people are converted into Christianity, in the Billy Graham Crusades, for example, they're converted into a religion that has already had the holy migrated. And they're converted into a culture and a mindset which is utterly, there's poverty in the mindset, because it has no awareness that joining the way of Jesus is like joining an alternative kingdom. They think of joining the way of Jesus as joining like a private decision that you're going to make. And that you're all, they think of the church as smaller than the nation, that the nation is the protector and the church nestles within the nation.
Yeah.
Whereas the previous vision, the earliest Christians and then the medieval Christians, they thought of the church as overarching everything, and nations nestled within. And what we've seen is the opposite has now happened, and it's led to this absolutely impoverished Christian imagination, that even people who think they are being converted into Christianity have no sense that they're joining an alternative political movement. They're not ever taught or given the options to think that the way of Jesus might actually be a viable and livable set of actions and affections and allegiances. They're not taught that the word faith in the New Testament, you probably know this already, the word faith is pistos, which doesn't mean internal assent to a series of propositions, which is the way evangelicals think of it.
Yep.
It means allegiance.
Yeah.
It's a political word. And when Jesus says, have faith in me, he means be willing to be seen to be with me. Follow me, like be with me. Having faith in Jesus means being with him and doing as he did, having allegiance to him. And it was the early Christians, when they sat around trying to find words to describe their new movement, they didn't use religious words. They said king and kingdom and faith and even gospel, which is the word that the Romans would use to describe the advent of a new king. So all the earliest Christian imagination was, we are starting a new kingdom. We're a political group. And that has just withered on the vine 2,000 years later. And Christians don't even think of themselves as political anymore.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. So there's a few questions coming through on the chat. If you'd like to ask questions as well, then try and put your little blue hand up and I'll see you. But so there's a couple of questions that are about Bethel, if you're willing to maybe talk around that. So I think there's kind of a question asking, what might, I think they're asking what other nationalistic megachurches are there, but maybe it might be better to talk about what are some safe
things. It's easier to tell you who's not nationalistic.
Yeah.
Brian Zahnd, Z-A-H-N-D, he has openly rejected nationalism. Greg Boyd, openly rejected nationalism. That's it. I mean, it's almost it. There are some. Even I did a little episode on my website, on my theology, on the podcast, where I talked about various resources you could turn to. And I was specifically trying to think about Americans, because I didn't want to just be anti-American. Like, no, there are American voices, but it is easier to mention the few who are good rather than keep listing everyone who's bad, because they are all captured by imagination, by patriotism. They all are, basically. It's a statistical, minuscule minority that isn't.
Maybe we can put a link to that list of resources, or that that might be helpful for people. Someone wants to know, given your views on Bethel, why did you go? Well,
I went because my wife wanted to go there to do a year of their training, because she was we both were impressed by people we'd seen who'd gone to Bethel and come back to the UK. We were impressed by them, and my wife wanted to go and experience it firsthand. So it was like, fair enough. She's traveled around the world for all of my ridiculous degrees. So I'm going to do something with her to sow into her vocation. And I will say that when we went, I'm a political theologian who doesn't like nationalism. So I can tell you, I was actively looking for like Trump bumper stickers in the Bethel church parking lot and that kind of stuff. And I only ever saw one. And when I was there, that was when he won the election, and they did a pretty good job of kind of holding back a bit. And it was obvious that they were that some of them were Trumpy, and I didn't like their reasoning and I didn't agree with them, but it's got a lot worse.
Okay.
In the 4 years since I was there, so I left in mid 2017. In the 4 years since I was there, it is way worse now. And they were not, what they are now is not what they were 4 years ago.
Okay.
And we've watched nationalism root and really pull that movement off track. We've watched it happen. And it's really sad, and I've grieved real tears over it. They have lost my ear, and I do not recommend anybody to go there or to absorb their material. There are some good people there. One of my best friends still works on the staff team there, and he is not a Trumpy guy, and he finds it, as you can imagine, extremely difficult. Yeah,
hard work. Yeah. So there's always this tension, isn't there? I think. Sorry.
What do you mean? What tension?
Between kind of no one's completely awful, and no one's completely great.
Well, that's what they often. It's like, yeah, but Bill Johnson's such a nice guy. I'm like, I didn't say he wasn't a nice guy.
Yeah.
I'm saying that he doesn't teach the way of Jesus.
Yeah.
And by the way, I'm a nice guy. How come you don't listen to me? Being a nice guy isn't the mark of true theology.
Yeah. So we've got a question about the Trump followers who believe that they've not lost the election, or that it's been stolen from them. So they genuinely believe this because they believe they have got a right as Christians to be running the country.
Well, the passion,
that's the kind of angle.
Their passion, their nationalist fervor and passion for Trump comes from their perceived right to run the country. The inability to recognize facts and truth comes from a paranoid style in the culture. I grew up this way. So I'm 44. So when I was a teenager, 13 to 16, 17, and I was going to these schools, in these schools I was being taught not to trust the media, and they all hate you, and it's all relative, and it's all fake news. They didn't use the word fake news, but they were like, it's a deep, this was in Canada. But it's been going for a generation or more of people who are deeply distrustful of anything that's not coming from a pre-approved source. And that the pre-approved source, the fault lines are basically, is it patriotic enough, or does it promote the image of our nation that we think is the right one? And so, that's why they don't believe any of this stuff, because they've been primed for a long time to not trust anything that doesn't come out of their pre-judged sources, right? Which is, Fox News was invented for them, for this culture. It was a market decision. They realized they could make money by catering to precisely that paranoid subgroup, which isn't really a subgroup. It's a major, as we can see, it's half of the country. Again, this part is the language coming out of evangelicals is they're an oppressed minority.
Yeah.
The reality is they are a huge, major, sometimes majority group,
right,
with multiple television networks aimed just at them, and multiple strands of markets and an entertainment industry and everything aimed just at them.
Yeah.
But there you go. That's part of where that's why they don't believe the election they don't believe the results, because it didn't come from sources they trust.
So what is going to happen when Biden is sworn in as president, and how do you think how will they deal with that cognitive dissonance? That I've already seen that chap from Bethel who prophesied that Trump would win, and then he posted an apology saying, oh no, I prophesied wrong, and now he's deleted that.
Right.
There seems to be a lot of sort of
the one decent thing you could do was apologize for getting your prophecy wrong, and he apologized, and then he retracted and deleted his own apology.
Yeah. Yeah. So is that
it's going to get worse. So Susie, your question was, what's going to happen? It's going to get worse.
okay?
Because think how bad it is now when people are fueled by the narrative that they are an oppressed minority. Now, what's going to happen when they really are an oppressed minority? Like, the world is fed up with them, right? Like, I have no respect for anything that they stand for, and I'm a Christian. Like, the world is fed up with them now, and America in lots of ways is, and so they really are going to be an oppressed minority, or at least a lot of their perceptions are going to start coming true. So it's going to get a lot worse. And often you point out, like, somebody like a Trump is he's clearly doesn't believe any of the stuff he's saying. Like, he's just going with whatever gets him a cheer from the room, right? Whatever group likes him, then he'll say what that. And so he's this narcissist personality disorder where he gravitates to what's going to feed his ego. So he doesn't actually believe any of this stuff. There are people coming up through the wings, including Republicans who won elections in the last couple of days, who actively believe QAnon and the conspiracy theories. They actively do believe that the rapture is going to happen, or that the liberals are baby-eating Satanists. Like, they actually believe that. And they're the ones coming into positions of power. They're coming up through the ranks right now. So it's going to get a lot worse. Yeah.
There's a question here about if you feel things have changed so radically in 4 years, how easy would that be to turn it around? Bearing in mind you've expressed the foundations of Christian nationalism are kind of from the beginning, from the birth of the US.
Well, I think what I think we're seeing. Okay, I guess I've been very negative here. I think nationalism is really bad, but Jesus is really good. And the measure I'm using against Christian nationalism is Jesus himself. Like, he is the measure that I'm using against Christian nationalism. I'm not judging Christian nationalists by some secular Marxist socialist paradigm. I'm using Jesus Christ himself as my measure of how good or bad Christian nationalism is. And a lot of other people are doing that. They are noticing it. Because one of the things Christian nationalists, they have to do is they basically still have to have the Bible. They don't read all of it. They don't like all of it, but they still have to have it. And every once in a while, people actually read it. They read the New Testament. And what we're starting to notice is a lot of people are really latching onto, like, that language of, well, I'm not a Christian, but I'm a follower of Jesus. And it's almost like the word Christian is just, it belongs. I see it as very similar in some ways to, like, the word gay. Because, okay, fine, technically the word gay can mean happy and carefree, but come on, it means homosexual. We all know it, right? And you could die on the hill of talking about what that word means, or you could just get with the program and go, fine, words change, their meaning changes. And it's possible that that is happening with the word Christian. And I think we're starting to see a dividing line culturally between nationalist Christians and followers of Jesus, including in this country. That a lot of people are looking at, like, established Christianity, which seems to be a lot more about being part of the fabric of society and a cultural, a social arm of the state or whatever. And they're saying, well, I think following Jesus looks different than fitting neatly onto the political spectrum of right or left and that kind of thing. So this is one of the things I'm noticing. I think that the Christians who call themselves Christians are probably going to get louder and angrier and more paranoid, and they might win a couple more elections. But you're also going to see that their numbers are going to dwindle. I don't think they're going to be attracting lots of new people. And it might be that this is the final throes, the kind of death thrashes of a dying movement. And I think they might take the word Christian with them. I'm not sure.
Okay.
And I'm meeting a lot of people. I do meet a lot of people who think that they're having a crisis of faith because they don't be a Christian anymore. But when you speak to them for about 5 minutes, it basically they don't want to be an American nationalist anymore.
Yeah.
And I just say, well, that's not a crisis of faith.
Yeah.
And so then they're starting to use this language of, well, I'm just following Jesus now. I can't use that word anymore because it means something different now. The word Christian. So I suspect something like that might happen a lot.
Yeah, that's interesting. I see quite that sort of deconstruction, kind of post-evangelical, ex-evangelical conversation that sometimes is not very healthy actually as well. But there are some spaces, aren't there, where that's being reframed quite helpful.
And I know we talk a lot about America, and I'm really not trying to be anti-American in a sort of broad swath way. I would point out, though, that even in this country, whenever I meet somebody who really feels like they're losing their faith or really angry at Christianity, it's always the American style. And like the things that are most upsetting to people are the things that have a direct connection to American influence or thought process, the prosperity gospel or nationalism, or like it's all American versions of Christianity that are taking root in this country, that are influencing this country, that are then sending people away. So I'm not trying to be like anti-American in some sort of immature way. What I'm trying to say is the American nationalist influence on our Christian imagination here in this country is not good. And it's quite powerful in some sections of society.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And to realize Jesus is so much better than Christians.
Yeah, there's a gospel. There are loads of questions still, actually. I think we've got time just for one more, but you'll hang around for a few minutes after we say goodbye. So if you've got something that's burning, you really want to ask Stephen, then he will give us a few more minutes after we've officially finished. But someone would like to know if there is a church that you do feel comfortable in, and could you please tell us about it? So what kind of space, brings you life in your faith? Have you found?
No, there's loads of them. There's loads of them. They just might not be famous. I mean, this is part of the problem, is that part of the culture of celebrity, it's a success culture. It's like, unless they have a big name, unless there's a big stage, unless there's a bright light shining on them, unless there's a media empire behind them, we don't listen to them or respect them. But that itself, that measure of success is itself something that's been captured. It's basically the American dream that's been turned into Christian form. And that is not what Jesus does, right? So there's loads of churches that I have connections to. My job is to speak to different churches all the time. I have ongoing working relationships with churches all over Ireland, UK, Canada, and even America. None of them are famous. People running them are celebrities. They're just getting on with it. They don't have American flags or Canadian flags in their churches. They're just getting on with being alternative members of a new kingdom. There's loads of them, absolutely. But they're not mega big churches they're not Instagram influencers, put it that way.
Sure. Tell me about Chaplaincy, because is that where you kind of...
Oh yeah, you came to visit, didn't you?
Yeah. And it's just
a little conference there once.
I just like quite a surprising. It's like a nice positive story, I think, to end with.
Yeah. So my wife and I are part of a church community. We got invited to come down here. It's a Church of England church. It's a village Anglican church, and they are. It's called the Chaplaincy churches. It's a little network of 3 little village churches in West Sussex, in the village of Ashington, and it's very near where the Wildfires Festival and the David's Tent Festival. It's very near there. Like the land where those festivals happen is 5 minutes walk away from my house right now. And so it's this odd situation that it's a sleepy little village, and then every summer, well, until coronavirus hit, 10, 15,000 Christians would descend on the place. And what I like about my little environment here is that they're not going for the big crowds. Now that coronavirus has stopped all those Christian festivals from happening, my little church is just still ticking over normally because they're not addicted to the big crowds. And they're just a group of people who are actively wanting to live in kingdom kind of ways. They love Jesus, and they really value worship really well. And they're just trying to be faithful to Jesus. But there's quite a lot of life here and friendship. So it was some friends that invited us down, and we really enjoyed being part of this community here. Yeah.
So there's
they get very humble. They're not empire building, you know.
Yeah, right. This
Yeah.
anxiety that the Church of England have with growth and decline.
Yeah.
Just need to let it go and let God. But I could talk forever about that, so we won't get into that. Thank you so much, Stephen. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you and to have your time.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
You're my friend. It's nice to see you again.
Yeah.